Drake Whitfield was 38 years old, a licensed architect who built other people's dreams for a living. And, until a Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta, he believed he was building one of his own. He had a firm, a house in the suburbs, and a wife named Petra, who handled their finances because he trusted her completely. What he didn't know was that for 18 months, while he was still sleeping beside her, still signing whatever she placed in front of him, Petra had been quietly dismantling everything he owned, transferring savings, pulling equity from their home, positioning herself to walk away with everything, including half his firm. The divorce papers arrived before a single argument ever did. 60 days later, Drake Whitfield was sleeping on a twin bed in his brother's spare room with nowhere else to go. Petra told her best friend he would be fine, that he never needed much anyway. 3 years later, she was standing in the foyer of his 6,000-square-foot Buckhead mansion, crying, asking him for help. And Drake looked down at her from the top of a staircase he designed himself, in a house he built from nothing, and said absolutely nothing. What happened in that sitting room would change both their lives forever. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Through the half-finished windows of someone else's dream home, Drake Whitfield watched the late morning light angle across imperfect joints and hasty finish work. His trained eye caught every shortcut the developer had taken, the slightly off-centered door frames, the rushed drywall seams that would crack within 5 years, the bathroom tile work that wouldn't survive a decade of seasonal shifts. He ran his calloused hand along a window frame, feeling the subtle imperfections beneath the surface shine. After 15 years as a licensed architect, his fingers could read a building like Braille. These weren't the kinds of homes he used to design, back when he had his own firm. But for now, this was the work he could get. Detail finishing on other people's compromised visions. The radio in his old truck crackled with static as he ate lunch alone in the cab, his worn thermos of coffee balanced on the dashboard. The odometer had just clicked past 190,000 miles. Drake watched the construction crews move across the site, each person focused on their specific task. He understood that kind of focus. It had carried him from his working-class Memphis childhood all the way to becoming the first person in his family to earn a professional license. His mother had raised him and his brother August on a housekeeper's salary, stretching every dollar until it screamed. She'd drilled into them both that education was the only ladder worth climbing. Drake had taken that lesson to heart, earning a scholarship to study architecture, working construction jobs through college to pay for his books and supplies. The calluses on his hands weren't new, they were just different now, earned from choosing to do detail work himself rather than necessity. He'd built Whitfield Design Group from nothing but determination and an unwavering commitment to structural integrity. Small, firm, solid reputation. Custom homes mainly, with a few commercial contracts, enough to afford a comfortable 4-bedroom house in the quiet suburbs and maintain a reliable savings cushion. It wasn't flashy, but it was built to last, just like everything else Drake put his hands to. Taking another sip of cooling coffee, he thought about Petra. They'd met at a healthcare construction project meeting when he was 29, her sharp intelligence and social grace catching his attention immediately. She was beautiful in the specific way of someone who had carefully constructed every aspect of their presentation to the world. As a hospital administrator, she moved through professional spaces with natural authority, always 3 steps ahead in any conversation. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of shared ambitions and electric connection. They'd married within 18 months of meeting, both certain they'd found someone who matched their drive and capability. 9 years together now. No children, though Drake had always wanted them. Petra always had reasonable explanations for why it wasn't the right time. Her career trajectory, market conditions, the need to build more security first. Drake had accepted her reasons with the same patience he brought to everything else. She handled all their household finances, having a natural head for numbers and administrative details that Drake was happy to defer to. He signed the papers she put in front of him without scrutiny. Tax documents, investment reallocations, account transfers. He trusted her completely, the way he trusted his own understanding of load-bearing walls and foundation requirements. The afternoon sun was starting to sink when Drake pulled into his driveway. The house looked different somehow, a subtle wrongness he couldn't immediately place. The key turned in the lock with its familiar click, but the sound echoed differently in the space beyond. He stepped into emptiness. The furniture was gone. Every piece they'd chosen together over 9 years of building a home. The walls were bare, bright rectangles marking where their photographs had hung. The built-in shelves he'd installed himself stood empty, dust outlining where their books and collected memories had lived until this morning. Moving through the hollow rooms, Drake noticed the filing cabinet in his home office standing open, specific documents missing. The safe in their bedroom closet gaped open like a wound. Petra's clothes were gone, her organized closet replaced by empty hangers that swayed slightly in the air conditioning's artificial breeze. In the kitchen he'd renovated himself 3 years ago, matching the countertop height exactly to Petra's preferred cooking stance. A single piece of paper lay centered on the island, 8 words in her precise handwriting. "I need more than this. My attorney will be in touch." Drake stood in that stripped kitchen, his hands still dusty from the day's work, staring at the bare walls that had yesterday held the life he thought they were building together. The evening light slanted through windows that now felt like strangers, casting unfamiliar shadows across the empty floor. Drake sat at the bare kitchen counter the next morning, his coffee untouched beside him, scrolling through divorce attorney listings on his phone. His criteria were simple: someone affordable, someone available quickly. He couldn't match whatever legal firepower Petra would bring, but he needed to start somewhere. He found a modest family law practice with decent reviews and made the call. "Daniels Family Law, how can I help you?" "I need to schedule a consultation about a divorce." His voice caught slightly on the last word. It was the first time he'd said it out loud. The receptionist's voice softened with practiced sympathy. "We have an opening this Thursday at 2 p.m. with Mr. Daniels." "I'll take it." Drake wrote down the details on the back of a hardware store receipt, the only paper he could find in the empty house. The next few days passed in a blur of document gathering and preliminary meetings. Mr. Daniels was a tired-looking man in his 50s who carried the weight of other people's broken marriages in the slump of his shoulders. He listened carefully as Drake explained the situation, taking notes in cramped handwriting. "We'll start with discovery," Daniels said. "Financial records first. That's usually where we find what we need to know." What they found stopped Drake's breath in his chest. The financial records painted a picture so precise in its calculation that it made Drake's architectural drawings look loose in comparison. Over 18 months, Petra had systematically moved their shared savings into accounts held solely in her name. Small transfers at first, carefully sized to avoid triggering alerts. Investment reallocations, she'd called them, when Drake signed the papers. Each move legal, each move documented, each move designed to slowly drain their shared resources into vessels only she could access. "The second mortgage is what concerns me most," Daniels said, spreading documents across his desk. Drake stared at a loan document he didn't remember signing, but there was his signature, rushed and trusting, given without reading because Petra had said it was routine paperwork for a tax strategy. The house they'd bought together, the house Drake had renovated with his own hands, was now leveraged nearly to the point of being underwater. Petra had extracted the equity through that second mortgage and funneled it into private investment accounts under her control. "There's more," Daniels said quietly, "and you're not going to like this part. The firm, Whitfield Design Group. In its early years, when they were first married and trying to establish the business, Petra had suggested listing herself as a silent financial partner. A tax strategy, she'd said. A way to protect their shared assets, she'd said. Drake had agreed without fully understanding the implications. Now her attorneys were moving to claim half the firm's valuation in the settlement. The numbers were impossible. Drake couldn't raise that kind of buyout capital. Not with his personal accounts drained and his home equity gone. Not in time to stop what was coming. "We could fight it," Daniel said. But honestly, with the documentation she has in place and the timeline of these filings, the timeline. That was the second blow, the one that landed even harder than the financial devastation. Daniels's team had uncovered the dates of Petra's first financial moves. She had begun extracting their shared resources 2 months before she ever mentioned being unhappy, before any arguments, before any signs of trouble. While they were still having Sunday brunches and planning home improvements, and living what Drake thought was their shared life. "This wasn't emotional," Drake said quietly, looking at the dates. "This was architecture." He understood architecture. This was a demolition planned in advance, with every load-bearing support systematically removed before the final walls came down. 60 days after signing the final divorce documents, Drake stood in his empty driveway watching the foreclosure notice flutter in the evening breeze. The house would go to auction within the week. His firm, the thing he'd built from nothing, the professional identity he'd earned one client and one project at a time, had been liquidated in the settlement. He loaded his drafting tools into the truck carefully, each one a reminder of the work he'd done and the work he wouldn't be doing anymore. The specialized rulers, the precise pencils, the tools of a trade he'd mastered only to have it stripped away. They barely filled half the truck bed. The drive to College Park took 40 minutes in evening traffic. August's apartment complex was modest, but well-maintained. The kind of place that attracted people who were either starting out or starting over. Drake parked in the visitor spot and sat for a moment, looking up at his brother's second-floor unit. August met him at the door without ceremony. "Spare room's ready," he said simply. "Got the twin bed made up." Drake nodded, not trusting his voice. Through the open door, he could see August's weight equipment lined up against the wall of the spare room, leaving just enough space for the narrow bed. It wasn't much, but it was somewhere to land. "Thank you," Drake managed finally. Drake sat on the edge of the twin bed in August's spare room, surrounded by weight equipment and the faint smell of rubber mats. The yellow legal pad balanced on his knees felt too bright under the single lamp, its empty lines waiting for something. He uncapped his pen and wrote one word at the top of the page. "Rebuild." He underlined it twice, each line precise and dark. Then he closed the pad, set it on the floor beside the bed, and turned off the light. 3 years later, Drake stood on his balcony overlooking Atlanta's Buckhead district, phone pressed to his ear as Flora walked him through the final details for tomorrow's groundbreaking ceremony. "The press will arrive at 9, Flora said, her voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who had watched him rebuild from nothing and taken genuine satisfaction in the result. $12 million of mixed-use development tends to draw attention, as long as they spell Whitfield and Associates correctly in the coverage," Drake said, smiling slightly. He could hear Flora shuffling papers on her end. 14 employees, 3 major markets, and you're still worried about the letterhead, she teased. Some things haven't changed, but many things had. Drake looked out over his property. 6,000 square feet of carefully considered space he'd designed himself. Every angle and proportion exactly as he'd drawn it. The Range Rover sat in the circular driveway, its dark paint gleaming in the morning sun. Inside, his housekeeper was probably already starting her Saturday routine. The rebuild had been methodical. First, subcontract work, taking whatever came through Flora's network of developers and contractors. She'd known Drake before the divorce, had seen his work ethic up close on shared projects. When everything fell apart, she'd been the one to make the calls, to vouch for him when his credit was destroyed and his firm was gone. "You're good," she'd said simply. "The rest will come back if you just keep building." She'd been right. Every dollar went back into the business. Every successful project led to another referral. Flora's minority partnership in the new firm, Whitfield and Associates, gave them institutional credibility that accelerated everything else. Now they had active contracts across 3 states, a reputation for excellence, and a portfolio that spoke for itself. "The community partners confirmed for tomorrow?" Drake asked, bringing his focus back to the call. "All set. This is good work, Drake. Workforce housing with actual design consideration. It's what this city needs." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. The development would provide 48 units of affordable housing above street-level retail, designed with the same attention to detail he brought to luxury projects. It mattered to him that people who worked hard would have beautiful spaces to come home to. "August coming tomorrow?" Flora asked. "Of course." Drake smiled again, thinking of his brother. He'd helped August buy his own home last year, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with good bones and a yard big enough for a garden. It felt right, completing that circle of support. "And Grace?" "She'll be there." The warmth in his voice when he mentioned Grace was subtle, but present. Their relationship was still new, but it felt grounded in a way his marriage never had. Grace understood space the way he did. She saw the possibilities in empty lots, the way light could shape experience, the importance of proportion and patience. A noise from downstairs interrupted his thoughts. His housekeeper answering the door, unusual for a Saturday morning. Then a voice he hadn't heard in 3 years carried up the stairs. Drake's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "Flora, I need to call you back." He ended the call and stood very still for a moment, listening. The voice came again, familiar but altered, carrying a strain that hadn't been there before. Walking to the top of the grand staircase, Drake looked down into his foyer. Petra stood just inside the door, and the sight of her was like looking at architectural drawings from an abandoned project, recognizable but no longer relevant to the current structure. She was thinner than he remembered, her designer clothes well-maintained but slightly dated, the careful presentation of someone holding on to the appearance of a life that had already crumbled. Her eyes were red and swollen, not from recent tears, but from the kind of crying that happens over days or weeks, wearing grooves into a person's composure. But it was her expression when she looked up and saw him that carried the most information. Something cracked open in her face, not performed grief, not calculated affect, but genuine devastation. Drake recognized it for what it was, the particular pain of seeing someone you had wounded and finding them not just healed, but rebuilt into something stronger than what you had tried to break. "Drake," she said, her voice unsteady, "I need to talk to you." He descended the stairs without hurrying, each step measured and deliberate. When he reached the bottom, he gestured toward the sitting room. "You've got 20 minutes. Drake gestured to one of the leather armchairs in his sitting room, taking the opposite seat himself. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows he'd designed specifically for this space, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Petra settled into the chair, and he watched as she pulled composure around herself like armor, a familiar gesture from their 9 years together. She smoothed her skirt, a practiced movement that bought her a moment to steady her voice. "Thank you for seeing me, Drake. I know this isn't easy." He said nothing, simply waited. The silence stretched between them until she filled it. "Warren's firm," she paused, choosing her words with visible care. "The private equity venture he was running, it wasn't real. The SEC is investigating him for securities fraud. The returns were fabricated. The investments were shells. Everything's gone." Drake noticed how she said everything rather than everyone's money, distancing herself from personal responsibility even now. He kept his face neutral, hands relaxed on the chair's arms. The money I moved during our divorce. Her voice caught slightly. I invested all of it with his firm. It's gone. Not reduced. Gone completely. There's nothing left to recover. Sunlight shifted across the room as a cloud passed overhead. Drake had positioned these windows to capture natural light throughout the day, one of many small, deliberate choices that made this house exactly what he'd designed it to be. But that's not the worst part, Petra continued, her composure cracking slightly. My name appears on documentation for 2 of his shell entities. He used my position, my credentials as a hospital administrator, to lend legitimacy to some of his ventures, make them look institutionally backed. She leaned forward slightly, hands clasped tight in her lap. The investigators have my name. They're looking at everyone connected to the documentation. The hospital placed me on administrative leave pending their internal review. My reputation in healthcare administration. She trailed off, the weight of what she wasn't saying filling the space between them. Drake observed how she held herself, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she kept glancing at the windows as if looking for escape routes. He remembered how she used to command rooms, how her confidence had seemed unshakable. The contrast was stark. I need help, Drake. Her voice steadied as she moved into what was clearly a rehearsed portion of the conversation. I need to retain a criminal defense attorney. A good one. I'm not asking for charity. This would be a loan. A practical arrangement between 2 adults who share history. Once this is resolved and I'm cleared, I'll repay everything. The once, rather than if, caught his attention. That old certainty still trying to assert itself even now. He filed it away with the other tells she didn't realize she was showing. When did the investigation start? He asked, his first words since they'd sat down. 6 weeks ago. When did Warren disappear? 4 weeks ago, Tuesday. Drake nodded once, absorbing the timeline without comment. He didn't ask where Warren had gone, or how much money was missing, or what her liability might actually be. Those weren't the important questions. The important questions were already answered in how she sat, how she spoke, how she'd framed everything since walking through his door. After a moment, he stood. I'll need to think about that. Petra opened her mouth as if to press further, then closed it. Something in his posture, or perhaps in the quiet authority of the house itself, seemed to tell her that pushing would be useless. He walked her to the front door himself, steps unhurried on the marble floors. Opening it, he stood aside and waited as she passed through. She paused on the threshold as if to say something else, but again seemed to think better of it. After she left, Drake stood alone in the foyer for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and called August. She came, he said simply. I know, August replied, no surprise in his voice. What are you going to do? Drake looked up at the coffered ceiling he'd designed, at the precise angles and clean lines that made the space feel exactly as he'd intended it to feel. What I always do, he said. Build something. The morning sun cast long shadows across Drake's home office desk as he opened a fresh legal pad. His architect's handwriting, precise, measured strokes, filled the page with names. People who had been in their shared orbit during the marriage. People who might have seen what he hadn't seen. He paused at Kendall's name, studying it for a moment before drawing a careful circle around it. Of everyone in their social circle, she had been closest to both of them. Close enough to see everything, distant enough now to maybe finally tell the truth. Drake picked up his phone, scrolled to a number he hadn't deleted but hadn't used in 3 years, and typed a simple message. Coffee? There are things we should discuss. Kendall's response came quickly. Yes, I've been waiting for this call. They met at a quiet coffee shop in Virginia Highland, away from the usual Atlanta social circles. Kendall was already seated when Drake arrived, 2 untouched cups on the table between them. She looked smaller than he remembered, not physically, but in the way people shrink under the weight of long-carried guilt. Thank you for meeting me, Drake said, settling into the chair across from her. Kendall's hands wrapped around her coffee cup, more for something to hold than to drink. "I've thought about reaching out so many times," she said, "but I didn't. I wasn't sure I had the right." Drake noticed how carefully she chose her words, the particular caution of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times in their head before having it out loud. "When did you know?" he asked simply. Kendall's grip tightened on her cup. "About Warren? A year before she filed. Maybe more." She looked down at her hands. "I told her she was wrong. Multiple times. I told her what she was doing to you was... that it wasn't right." "What did she say?" "She dismissed it. Every time. Said you'd be fine, that you were resilient, that you'd land on your feet." Kendall's voice caught slightly. "She said you never needed much anyway. Like that made it okay somehow. Like your contentment with a good life was something she could use against you." Drake absorbed this without visible reaction, though something in his chest tightened at those words. Never needed much anyway. The casual cruelty of it, the way it reframed his satisfaction with a well-built life into some kind of deficiency. "There's something else," Kendall said, reaching for her phone. "Something I should have shared years ago, but..." She scrolled through her photos, movements precise despite her slight tremor. "8 months before she served you papers, I was at a private dinner. Warren was there. Petra was there. They weren't being careful any." She turned the phone toward Drake. The photograph showed Petra and Warren at a corner table in what looked like an upscale restaurant's private dining room. His hand was on her lower back, intimate and possessive. She was looking up at him with an expression Drake recognized. It was how she used to look at him in the early years before she decided he wasn't enough. The timestamp in the corner was unmistakable. 8 months before she left that note on his kitchen counter. "I took it without really thinking about why," Kendall said quietly. "Some part of me knew it would matter someday. I never deleted it." Drake studied the photograph for a long moment, then handed the phone back. "Send it to this number," he said, writing down his attorney's direct line. "Now, please." Kendall's fingers moved over her screen. After a moment, she nodded. "Done." "Why keep it all this time?" Drake asked. "Because somewhere underneath everything, underneath my loyalty to her, underneath our friendship, I knew what was happening was wrong. Really wrong. Not just an affair, not just a marriage ending, but..." She trailed off, searching for words. "But a demolition," Drake finished quietly. "Carefully planned, precisely executed." Kendall's eyes filled. "I'm so sorry, Drake. I should have done more. Should have told you sooner. Should have..." "I appreciate your honesty," Drake said, cutting off the flow of guilt with quiet finality. He stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "The attorney will confirm receipt of the photograph. Thank you for your time." He left Kendall sitting at the table, her coffee still untouched, her guilt still visible but no longer his responsibility to carry or absolve. His car was already running when his phone buzzed, his attorney confirming receipt of the image, asking him to come to the office immediately. Drake put the car in drive, mind already moving to the next step. He had what he needed now, not for legal action against a long-settled divorce, but for something more precise, something structural. Drake was reviewing structural plans at his desk when his phone lit up with Petra's number. The sun had long since set over Atlanta, casting his home office in the warm glow of desk lamps. He let it ring twice before answering. "Yes?" His voice was neutral, measured. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" Petra's composure had slipped since their sitting room meeting. A tremor of desperation edged her words. "I'm considering it." Drake continued marking the blueprints before him, his architect's pencil making precise notations. "Drake, we were married for 9 years. I helped build that life, too. When your firm was just starting, my hospital salary kept us afloat. You remember that, don't you?" Her voice took on a practiced warmth, like someone trying to reignite an old connection. I remember everything, Petra. He made another notation, his handwriting steady. She called again 3 days later, catching him in his office at Whitfield and Associates. This time, her tone was carefully crafted to evoke shared history. Remember those Sunday mornings in the kitchen? How we used to plan everything together? I know things ended badly, but there was good there too. You know there was. Her voice softened. I'm not asking for charity, Drake. I'm asking for help from someone who once shared a life with me. Drake listened, noting how she reframed their history, casting herself as an equal partner in building what she had systematically dismantled. Is there anything else? He asked when she finished. The third call came a week after her visit. Drake was reviewing contract documents when his phone buzzed. This time, Petra's voice had an edge beneath its careful control. My attorney has been reviewing our old joint tax records, she said without preamble. He's noticed some potential discrepancies in the original settlement documentation, things that might warrant revisiting if we had to take a formal look. Drake set down his pen, giving the threat his full attention. Not because it carried weight, he knew it didn't, but because it revealed something crucial about her position. A woman with real leverage doesn't telegraph it. She was showing him exactly how empty her hands were. Is that all? He asked quietly. Drake, I'm trying to handle this reasonably between us, like adults who once meant something to each other. But if you force me to pursue other options, goodbye, Petra. He ended the call and sat in silence for a moment, thinking. Then he picked up his phone again and dialed Flora. I need Winston Okafor's number, he said when she answered. The attorney you mentioned. Finally, Flora replied. There was a smile in her voice. I'll text you his direct line. He's expecting your call. Winston's office was housed in a restored midtown building. Old Atlanta money, but understated about it. The conference room where they met had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Winston himself was 62, measured in movement and speech, with the specific gravity of someone who had spent 3 decades protecting black wealth from precisely the kind of calculated extraction Drake had experienced. Flora vouched for you, Winston said, studying the documents spread before him. She doesn't do that lightly. No, she doesn't, Drake agreed. Winston reviewed everything methodically. The original divorce settlement, the second mortgage documentation, the account transfer records, Kendall's photograph. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened at certain details. She committed financial fraud within the marriage, he said finally, looking up at Drake. The statute of limitations narrows our options for direct legal action, but this becomes extremely relevant if her name surfaces in Warren's federal investigation, which, given these documents, I expect it will. He pulled out a legal pad and began drafting in precise handwriting. We're going to put her on formal notice. Not threatening, not aggressive, just a clear accounting of the record and its potential relevance to ongoing federal matters. Drake watched him write, noting the careful construction of each paragraph. When Winston finished, he slid the document across the table. Sign here, he said, indicating the line. This isn't about vengeance. This is about accurate record-keeping. Drake picked up the pen, remembering that note on his kitchen counter. 8 words. 9 years. He signed his name with the same precise strokes he used on architectural drawings. Winston nodded once, satisfied. I'll have this delivered to her attorney this afternoon. And Drake? He gathered the documents carefully. The record matters. Sometimes it's all that does. Drake's shoes echoed against the hardwood floors as he entered his home office, Winston's folder tucked under his arm. The Atlanta evening pressed dark against the windows, city lights dotting the skyline like stars. He spread the documents across his desk methodically, financial transfers arranged chronologically, Kendall's photograph placed center, Winston's formal notice positioned last in the sequence. Each piece told part of a story. Together, they formed an architectural drawing of betrayal, every load-bearing beam, every calculated angle, every hidden joint exposed to light. His desk phone blinked with a message from Winston's office. The property records search had yielded results. Drake picked up the receiver and pressed play, his hand steady as he listened. Winston's measured voice filled the room. The apartment lease is confirmed. Warren's Shell LLC, Meridian Holdings, signed a 12-month agreement 5 months before your divorce filing. Fully furnished. All utilities arranged. I'm sending the documentation now. Drake opened his email. The lease agreement appeared in black and white. Dates, signatures, payment schedules laid out with corporate precision. He read every line, his architect's eye catching each detail. The move-in date aligned perfectly with the day Petra left that note on his counter. She had stepped from their marriage directly into a life already furnished and waiting. He leaned back in his chair, the full weight of it settling around him. The unhappiness she had claimed, the gradual dissolution she had described in careful terms to friends and family, it was all narrative architecture. A story built to make calculated extraction feel like organic ending. She had constructed her exit the way developers constructed pro formas, working backward from a desired outcome, filling in the justifying numbers along the way. The Atlanta skyline stretched beyond his windows, buildings he knew intimately, some containing his own work, invisible and essential, holding things up. He stood and walked to his small bar cart, selecting a bottle of bourbon he kept for moments that required ceremony. The liquid caught the desk lamp's light as he poured 2 fingers into a heavy glass. He didn't slam it back. He wasn't angry in the way that required gesture. He sat in his chair, held the glass, and looked out at the city he had rebuilt himself in. The truth wasn't that Petra had stopped loving him. The truth was that she had never loved him more than she loved what she could extract from him. The marriage had been real for him and theoretical for her, a structure she occupied until a more advantageous property became available. The bourbon went down smooth and warm. Drake set the glass on his desk, perfectly centered on a coaster, and picked up his phone. He dialed Petra's number with the same precision he used marking measurement lines on blueprints. She answered on the second ring. "Drake?" Her voice carried hope, poorly concealed beneath professional composure. "I've made a decision," he said evenly. The city lights reflected in his window, steady and constant. "Come to the house Sunday. Come alone." "I'll give you my answer." "Yes, of course." Relief flooded her voice, the sound of someone who thought they were winning something. "What time?" 10 in the morning. "I'll be there." She paused, then added with careful warmth, "Thank you, Drake. I knew you'd—" "Goodbye, Petra." He ended the call before she could finish constructing whatever sentiment she had prepared. He set the phone down and looked again at the documents spread across his desk. The complete architectural drawing of what she had built and what she had demolished. The younger version of him, the one who slept on August's twin bed, would have wanted revenge. But revenge was emotional, and emotions were unreliable building materials. This wasn't about revenge. This was about accurate record-keeping. Drake stood and walked to his drafting table where blueprints for the mixed-use development waited. He adjusted his lamp, uncapped his favorite technical pen, and began marking revisions with the particular focus of a man who understood that everything worth building required patience, precision, and absolutely clean lines. Behind him, the city continued marking its own time, adding light to darkness one window at a time. Morning light filtered through Drake's sitting room windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. August arrived at 9:30, letting himself in with the spare key Drake had given him years ago. The brothers exchanged a quiet nod, the particular greeting of men who had shared enough space to make words optional. Drake gestured to the corner chair, positioned deliberately, close enough to witness, far enough to give the coming conversation its proper space. August settled in, arms folded across his chest, his presence solid and unremarkable as foundation stone. The sitting room held the careful warmth of Drake's design sensibility. Clean lines, softened by natural materials, everything chosen for purpose rather than display. Light played across the leather chairs, the oak coffee table, the simple art pieces that anchored each wall. Even the folder waiting on the side table seemed placed with architectural intention. At precisely 10, the doorbell chimed. Drake's housekeeper showed Petra in. She wore a tailored navy dress that spoke of careful calculation. Professional without being severe. Elegant without being showy. Her makeup was perfect, her hair smoothed into place. She had rebuilt her composure since their last meeting, armoring herself in the particular polish she had always worn like a second skin. Drake. She smiled with practiced warmth, using the soft pronunciation of his name she had used through 9 years of marriage, trying to invoke intimacy they no longer shared. Her eyes flickered to August, but returned to Drake immediately. "Thank you for seeing me again." Drake gestured to the chair across from his. She sat with the particular grace of someone who had spent a career making difficult conversations look easy. She placed her handbag beside her chair, a designer piece that had seen better days, Drake noticed. Small signs of wear around the handles, a slight scuff at one corner. Like her clothes, maintained, but not current. "I want you to know how much I appreciate you considering this," she began, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who had rehearsed their opening lines. "I've always known you to be fair, even when things were difficult between us. That's who you are. Someone who sees the larger picture." She paused, gauging his response. Drake's face remained neutral, attentive but unrevealing. She continued, gaining confidence from his silence. "What I'm asking for isn't charity. It's a loan between two people who shared a life, who built something together." Her hands moved in small, precise gestures, the way they used to move when she presented hospital budgets to her board. "Once this legal situation resolves, I'll be able to—" Drake held up one hand, not dismissively, simply indicating completion. Then he reached for the folder. He laid the first document on the coffee table between them. The financial transfer timeline, 18 months of systematic extraction, each transaction highlighted in clean yellow marks. Petra's eyes fixed on the dates, her throat working slightly. The second document, the apartment lease in Warren's name, dated 5 months before she served Drake papers. Her fingers twitched in her lap. The third, Kendall's photograph, 8 months before the divorce filing. Petra and Warren at that private dinner, his hand on her lower back, her head tilted toward him with familiar intimacy. The timestamp glowed in the corner like an accusation. Finally, Winston's letter, already sent, already in the record, documenting the full history and its relevance to Warren's federal investigation. Drake placed each piece with the same careful precision he used, placing structural elements in his designs. When the last document settled, he sat back and waited. Petra stared at the array before her. Her carefully constructed composure began to crack, not in dramatic gestures, but in the small tells of someone watching their narrative dissolve. A slight tremor in her hands, a thickness in her throat, a brightness in her eyes that wasn't performance. She looked at the photograph and suddenly remembered Sunday mornings in their old house. Drake's coffee appearing on her bathroom counter at exactly the right temperature before she was fully awake. His hands always slightly marked from work he couldn't resist doing himself. Small, consistent acts of care she had catalogued as insufficient while planning her exit. Acts that now, sitting in this house he built without her, facing this life he constructed from her wreckage, arrived with devastating weight. "Drake," she said, and his name broke in her throat. Real tears spilled, smearing her careful makeup. Not the strategic tears she had deployed in negotiations throughout her career. These were uglier, honest, the grief of a woman who had designed a future, built it, moved into it, and discovered too late that she had demolished the only real thing she ever had. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Then again, louder, "I'm so sorry." She meant it completely, and the completeness of it, arriving 3 years too late, filled the room like smoke. Drake watched her cry without looking away. He gave her his full attention, not as comfort, but as witness. When her tears slowed enough for her to hear him clearly, he spoke in the particular tone of someone who had waited a long time to say a true thing. "I believe you," he said quietly. "And it doesn't matter." Monday morning arrived with Atlanta's typical humid warmth. Drake pulled his Range Rover into his reserved spot at Whitfield and Associates, nodding to Sarah from accounting, who was juggling coffee and her laptop bag near the entrance. The glass doors slid open with a quiet whoosh, and the familiar scent of coffee and printer paper welcomed him. "Morning, Mr. Whitfield," called Jerome from the front desk, already fielding calls at 8 a.m. Drake returned the greeting with a small smile, his footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floors as he made his way to his office. The day unfolded like any other Monday. Project reviews at 9, client meeting at 11, lunch with the development team to discuss the West Atlanta mixed-use timeline. Drake moved through each hour with his characteristic focused calm, as though Sunday had never happened. For him, it hadn't. That chapter had closed the moment August showed Petra out. Summer faded into fall, and the consequences of documented truth began their quiet work. The federal investigation into Warren's firm expanded with the methodical patience of government machinery. Petra's name appeared in connection with 2 shell entities, not as a primary actor, but as a credentialed professional whose hospital administration background had lent legitimacy to fraudulent operations. The investigators called twice, their questions precise and thorough. They froze her assets during review, standard procedure that nevertheless left her scrambling for access to basic accounts. A civil suit filed by Warren's defrauded investors forced the unsealing of court documents. Petra's name appeared in black and white, her professional credentials listed beside shell company formations that now carried the weight of federal scrutiny. In Atlanta's business circles, particularly in healthcare administration, where reputation was currency, the information moved with devastating efficiency. The hospital system where Petra had built her career concluded its internal review by early October. The meeting was brief, held in a conference room she'd used countless times before. They offered severance rather than reinstatement, the language professional, the meaning clear. She was finished in Atlanta healthcare administration at the level she'd occupied for over a decade. Warren's indictment came down in 14 counts: securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy charges that would take years to fully prosecute. The future Petra had stripped her marriage to fund dissolved like morning fog, leaving nothing behind but legal bills and frozen accounts. Drake learned most of this peripherally, through industry channels and Winston's occasional updates. He didn't seek the information, but he didn't avoid it either. He simply noted each development with the same quiet attention he gave to project updates and structural reports. On a Wednesday in November, while Drake was reviewing blueprints for a Nashville contract, his phone lit up with Kendall's name. "She's gone back to Mississippi," Kendall said after brief pleasantries. "Staying with her parents while she manages the legal situation. They've got a place outside Jackson." Her voice carried a hint of pity, perhaps genuine, perhaps performative. Drake made a small sound of acknowledgement. "Are you okay?" Kendall asked, the question carrying the weight of their shared history. "I've been okay for a while now, Kendall," Drake replied simply. He thanked her again for her honesty, both then and now, and ended the call with the particular grace of someone closing a door that no longer needed closing. The late afternoon sun slanted through his office windows, painting golden rectangles across his drafting table. Drake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. at the geometry of human ambition rendered in steel and glass, at the particular poetry of things built to last. What he felt wasn't triumph. Triumph required investment in the outcome, required caring about the fall of someone who had once tried to engineer his own. This feeling was simpler, cleaner, the satisfaction of a structure passing its final inspection, of load-bearing calculations proving true under stress. He turned back to his drafting table where the Nashville blueprints waited. His pencil moved across the paper with practiced precision, adding small notes in the margins, adjustments for natural light, considerations for future maintenance, the 1,000 small details that separated adequate construction from architecture that served its inhabitants. The work absorbed him completely, as it always had. Outside his window, Atlanta continued its eternal cycle of building and rebuilding. But Drake was already focused on what came next, on the precise mathematics of creating something that would outlast its creator. Spring sunlight warmed the cleared lot in West Atlanta, where metal folding chairs faced a temporary podium. Behind it stood the project rendering, 48 workforce housing units rising above street-level retail, rendered in watercolor that caught the dignity Drake had designed into every angle. He adjusted his tie, a simple navy against crisp white, as the small crowd settled into their seats. Flora stood to his right, her hard hat sitting slightly crooked, despite multiple adjustments. She'd given up fixing it, letting it rest at its determined angle, while she beamed with the particular pride of someone who had witnessed both the bottom and the summit. Her hand rested on the shovel they'd use for the ceremonial first dig, though everyone knew the real work would start tomorrow with proper equipment and permits already in place. August moved through the gathering with his phone raised, documenting everything with the focused enthusiasm of someone determined to capture each moment. He photographed the rendering board 3 times from different angles. He caught Drake adjusting his tie, Flora straightening her hard hat one final time, the row of 14 Whitfield & Associates employees seated in the front row. These photos would be carefully curated and sent to their mother in Memphis before sunset, accompanied by proud text messages and multiple exclamation points. Grace stood near the back, wearing a simple linen dress that caught the spring breeze. She wasn't performing support or making a statement about their relationship. She was simply present, the way she had been for months now, comfortable in the periphery, steady in her choice to stay. When Drake caught her eye, she smiled the small, private smile that belonged to quiet Sunday mornings and unplanned evening walks. The ceremony began with the standard proceedings, the city council representative's remarks, the community partner acknowledgement, the polite applause at appropriate intervals. When Drake stepped to the podium, he carried no notes. He didn't need them. "I want to thank my team," he began, his voice carrying easily across the lot. He named all 14 employees in order of their hiring, each one receiving a moment of recognition. He spoke about Flora's mentorship with simple gratitude, not making a story of the reference she gave when his credit was destroyed, or the trust she placed in him when trust was all he had left. The foundation of that relationship was structural. It held everything up without needing to be seen. He talked about the project itself, the attention to natural light in every unit, the thoughtful integration of community spaces, the specific dignity of design that acknowledged its inhabitants as people who deserved beauty in their daily lives. He did not mention that he grew up in spaces that taught him this lesson by its absence. He did not need to. The building would speak for itself. After the ceremony, after the photos and handshakes and congratulations, Drake found himself sitting in his truck in the parking lot beside August, who was unwrapping sandwiches from the Memphis deli they'd grown up with. The same brown paper, the same wax paper wrapping, the same slightly excessive mustard that had marked every important moment of their lives together. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the lot where tomorrow construction would begin in earnest. August had brought these sandwiches to Drake's architectural school graduation, to the original Whitfield Design Group opening, to the day Drake signed the papers on this project. Neither of them ever mentioned this pattern. They didn't need to. "You ever think about her?" August asked finally, wadding up his sandwich paper. Drake looked out at the lot, at the rendering board still standing in the afternoon sun. He gave the question the consideration it deserved, neither rushing toward nor away from the answer. "Sometimes," he said, "the way you think about a building that got torn down. You remember it was there. You can picture what it looked like, but you don't wish it was still standing." August nodded, considering this. "You're good," he said. Not a question. "I'm good." "You're better than good," August added. "You're just too quiet about it." A small smile crossed Drake's face, unguarded, belonging to no audience but his brother. "I'm an architect, August," he said. "I let the buildings speak." August's laugh filled the truck cab, warm and contained, meant for no one else. The sun was setting when Drake pulled into his driveway later. He sat for a moment, engine off, looking at the facade of his home. Every proportion had been chosen deliberately at his drafting table. The ratio of window to wall, the specific angle of the roofline, the way evening light caught the western face exactly as he'd calculated it would. He'd designed this moment 3 years ago, this particular gift of light and shadow, and now he sat quietly in its reality. He allowed himself the moment. Then he went inside. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.